Welcome to Brighter Morning with Bo. My name is Bo Tiwari, and I'm so happy to be with you this morning. Our telephone numbers are 609-6283. You can call, and 609-6284. 609-6283. 609-6284. You are looking at Brighter Morning with Bo on MCTV, Multicultural TV, and listening on U97.5 FM radio. We're happy to be here this morning, Friday the 17th of September, and we have two interesting conversations ahead of us. One with Ms. Territa Kalloo, who is an intellectual property attorney. So we will talk about intellectual property issues with her. And secondly, we will talk to the Minister of Trade and Industry, and we'll talk about different things that this is pre-budget season, as you know. We are about 2 weeks away from the budget reading on October 4th. And we have talked to a number of ministers. We have been talking to a number of economists, and we will continue that discussion as we go on. We talk to people in the business community as well, and other people who have views and wish to express them on this. Before we go on to Ms. Kalloo in a few minutes, I just want to mention some of the things that were highlighted in the news that was just read by Chanel Al-Suran. First of all, the Tobago elections. Now that the Parliament has passed the EBC expansion of the number of seats from 12 to 15 in Tobago, you have a continuing controversy. First of all, you have a call? Okay, first of all, you have, let me just finish this thing on Tobago. First of all, you have a situation in which the opposition is threatening to take the matter to court. Secondly, you have unhappiness among the opposition parties in Tobago about the redrawing of the boundaries. And thirdly, of course, you have the PNM representatives in Tobago chastising the opposition in Tobago and the UNC in Parliament for attacking the EBC. So we'll move on to other things. Now the caller, you have a caller on the line. Let's talk to him or her.
Good morning, Dr. Tiwari.
Morning, how are you? Thanks for calling.
I'm okay, Dr. Tiwari. Dr. Tiwari, about a week ago, you had a professor from Barbados, I think he's advisor to the Prime Minister.
Yes.
And he said something that I'm still a little confused about. He said that 75% of the poorest people in the world do not live in the poorest countries of the world.
Yeah.
Right? And I remember Oprah Winfrey some years ago said 60 million Americans go to sleep hungry every night.
Yes.
Could you just elaborate, explain what the professor said?
Yeah, well, I can't verify the numbers because I'm not aware of what the numbers are. But the principle of what he said is this. The way countries are classified, among the poorest, you have the least developed countries. And the poor countries have a lot of poor people in them. There is no question about that. But I think the point that he was making is that in middle-income countries, less developed countries, not least, in middle-income countries, in less developed countries, and indeed in the wealthy countries of the world, you also have large numbers of poor because of the disparities in wealth in individual countries. For instance, in the Western Hemisphere, it might be very hard to believe this, but the Western Hemisphere, the countries between Canada in the north and Argentina in the south and all the countries in between, this is the region of greatest inequality in the entire world. In other words, the gap between rich and poor is severe. And that includes the United States, it includes Canada, and it includes all the countries in between, including our own. So the point he is making is that you have very poor countries in which you have poor people. You have less poor countries in which you have a lot of poor people generally. But in all the countries, the middle income, the high income, the wealthy countries, you have large numbers of poor as well. So that poverty is not something that is geographic in nature. It is structural in nature because of the economic system that we have. I hope that helps you to understand better.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a good question.
I just want to say one more thing.
Yeah.
About 13 to 14 years ago, my daughter was graduated from UV, right? And you were the principal.
Yes.
And she was getting a BSc in psychology. And your son, Derad, graduated with a master's degree.
Yes.
I was in the audience, right? And Dr. Ghani was also there. And when Derad went up for his pan, both of you hugged her. That was a nice occasion. Congratulations. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you for your good wishes. Always good. Thank you very much. So I think we have Ms. Territa Kalloo on the line, so we will not keep her any longer. We'll have a conversation with her, and let us welcome her to Brighter Morning with Bo. Morning. Territa, so nice to have you.
Hi, good morning, Dr. Tiwari. Very nice to be here.
Okay, let's lift her volume so people can hear her more clearly. All right, I'm going to start, Territa, by having you introduce yourself to the listening and viewing audience because you're not a public figure, but you are involved in an important kind of law. And I wonder if you can give the audience, listeners, viewers, a little idea of how your career has gone. I know you've been in the public service. I know you're in the private practice. But I know all along your career you have been involved in intellectual property issues. So could we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So I am an intellectual property attorney, and I have been practicing for the last 9 years. And I started my practice at the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs, where I worked alongside with the Attorney General and worked in something called a process review team that was used to fast track certain matters. As part of that ministry, you also have the Intellectual Property Office, where I then started specializing in intellectual property law. And immediately I saw the importance of it. I saw how it can help in terms of development in Trinidad and Tobago. And the Intellectual Property Office did a lot of public outreach and public education, which is something that was really needed in our jurisdiction. And so when I started my private practice, I decided, I am going to take this on from a private perspective and continue with the intellectual property education and see in what various ways I could contribute in terms of the private sector to development of intellectual property law. So I work with clients to help them with their intellectual property filings, and I also help in terms of strategic planning to help with intellectual property commercialization and exploitation.
All right, very good. That's a clear explanation. You mentioned two words that I want to focus on. You said intellectual property is very important. So I want you to explain the importance of intellectual property. Explain so an ordinary person can understand what intellectual property means, and secondly, why it is important, And the second thing is that you mentioned the word development. What is the connection between intellectual property and managing the laws around intellectual property and development?
Certainly. So, intellectual property is the express creations of the mind. So, it's your intellectual capital. When we're speaking about intellectual property, it could be various different types of intellectual property rights. So, you have, for example, patents, trademarks, and copyrights, which is basically the lion's share of intellectual property rights. We have many various pieces of legislation that govern intellectual property laws. We have 8 pieces of legislation, and reason being is that every type of intellectual property right is meant to protect various aspects of intellectual creations, protect it in various ways, protect it for various terms. And the reason why it's important is that it rewards persons who come up with innovative and new and creative creations with exclusivity. So they are given a period of time where they can exclusively exploit their product, so they can recoup whatever finances, whatever R&D would have gone into creation of it. And it is important to have solid and robust intellectual property laws because, firstly, you have to ensure that proper rights are given. So where someone creates something, someone else just can't come and use whatever they have created. They are able to commercially benefit from it. And where they commercially benefit from this spurs innovation because, of course, if you can recoup your R&D, if you can commercially exploit it, it gives you further resources to further develop, further innovate. And so it's important to have, firstly, laws to protect those rights. And also it is important to have laws to enforce those rights. So where someone has infringed on your works, you have proper recourse to recoup whatever damages that they may cause to your product or your service.
Okay. And what is the connection with development?
In terms of development, intellectual property rights gives you exclusive rights as an innovator.
Yes.
Where you have exclusive rights, you are able to grow much quicker, and you see it with any company that properly protects and exploits the intellectual property rights. So you are able to increase revenue, you are able to increase employment in the country. In terms of the economy, when you look at the companies that rely heavily on intellectual property rights, these are the same companies and entities that contribute the most to the economy as it relates to GDP, tax revenues, employment. And so where there are proper laws to protect them, naturally it contributes to the economy as a whole and it helps develop the economy. It also benefits society as a whole because the society then benefits from innovative products, creative products. They benefit from, having security, knowing, because, for example, you have certification marks. So they can look at a product and they can rely on it as being, as a particular standard, a particular quality. It increases competition because, of course, when you have your own innovative products, it increases competition, and so the members of the public are able to have more choices. And the beauty of the intellectual property system, so in terms of, for example, the patent system, is that it's a balanced approach. So the rights holder, they would get the exclusivity to exploit whatever innovation they would have come up with for a period of time. Most times it's 20 years, depending on whether they renew it annually. And after this time has expired, and when they make their application for the patent, they are required to disclose. So they have to disclose, for example, in detail how their innovation works. So once their rights are no longer protected, anyone in the public is allowed to use these, whatever this innovation is, and then also further develop the innovation. That in itself spurs further innovation and further development. And where you have a jurisdiction where you have very well developed intellectual property rights and proper enforcement of said rights, that in itself attracts direct foreign investment. It also attracts technology transfers. And I mean, we can look at, for example, Singapore as a case study in terms of how specifically it helps with development. So Singapore was a jurisdiction that was known for infringement and a lot of piracy. And what they did was they used intellectual property rights as a tool to develop a very intensive knowledge economy. And as a result, they saw a significant direct foreign investment coming into the country. For example, I think in 2019, they had over $40 billion US dollars in foreign investments coming in from the US. So they are a great case study to look at how a relatively small jurisdiction with relatively little resources can use a intensive knowledge-based economy to develop, towards development of their economy.
What you are saying there is extremely interesting because from 2 points of view, the whole point of intellectual property creation is that you want the creation of intellectual property, which are really creations of research, the mind, the imagination, and innovation to drive the development process.
Yes,
and
correct.
the second thing that you said, which was critical, which is that Singapore used to steal a lot of intellectual property initially. And many countries did that. They started with imitation and then went to innovation. I can mention 3 countries that are now very, very competitive that did that. One of them is Japan. Japan used to basically look at what the rest of the world was doing, take it to Japan, go through a reverse engineering process, and then they would do what other countries were doing as part of their development. You had the same thing in China. China would simply seize whatever exists anywhere, go back, work it through, and do it. South Korea, the same thing. And that is exactly what happened in Singapore as well, to a lesser degree, because it's a smaller country. And its whole development strategy was different. It really used the ports and logistics, etc., to be able to develop that country. So
Yes,
what you are saying there is very important. So tell me, in Trinidad and Tobago, I want to get to some of your clients and how you help to protect them and what they are doing for development without revealing their identities. But I want to ask you, on the research side in Trinidad and Tobago, do you sense, you come from government, you're now in the private sector, do you sense that there is enough connectivity between what is happening with research in the university and the development of patents and then the protection of intellectual property to make a difference in development? And do you also sense in Trinidad and Tobago that there is any concept of imitation to innovation?
So I definitely think that we have the resources, we have the laws, we have the enforcement measures to enable proper research and development in terms of creation of patterns. In terms of whether you're seeing that reflected locally, it is not. On an annual basis, we possibly have one or two local patents, which is significantly low, of course,
Okay.
given the fact that we do have resources.
Let me just stop you there. So we get one or two patents a year, while
Locally fine.
while Singapore is getting maybe 100. The United States is probably having 1,000. China is probably having a couple thousand. Japan is having a couple thousand. Is that the kind of ratio and proportion that we are looking at in terms of Trinidad and Tobago? And does that mean that the catch-up opportunity is not only wide, it requires fierce action?
I definitely think it does. I think we can significantly benefit from more incentives for innovation, for research, because the issue definitely is not a lack of laws. What I actually think is one of our major issues is possibly lack of education in terms of intellectual property specifically. So I consider not just our country, but our region to be very IP rich. We have a lot of innovative persons, we have a lot of creative persons. But whether that's being translated, I am not seeing it translated because we are not an IP savvy country. We are not aware of the possibilities that development of innovation or protection of your innovations can bring. And naturally, if you have a jurisdiction where you are fostering innovation, what this actually opens up, and which is something we should definitely look towards, is technology transfer. So worldwide, you have a lot of collaborations between institutions. So it could be between various government institutions, various universities, and we're pointing towards the university, where once they are proper rights, they are able to enforce their rights. And also, once there's a market where they could monetize and capitalize on these rights, they are willing to collaborate and transfer technology locally here. And what that means is that our local institutions can benefit financially from these innovations, and then also build upon those innovations. So it's not necessarily that we have to start from scratch, but once these entities are comfortable that we can properly protect their rights here, they will be open to giving us licenses to use their technology and develop upon it. They will be open to possibly joint ventures where they can lean on our resources and work collaboratively with our institutions locally, so that they can, there's a share in innovation and we are ahead in terms of innovating and developing further.
Let me get that. Well, one is that you can develop your own creative invention or your own creation, and you can establish intellectual property protection and rights for that. And the second thing that you are talking about is basically technology transfer, where somebody else creates that somewhere, but through a partnership arrangement, you bring that technology here, and you have two options then. One is to transfer the technology and own it in your domain, but the second thing is that you have the opportunity to customize it and culturalize it if you need to in your domain. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. And as long as we have the intellectual property rights, protection, and enforcement, these entities will be willing to provide licenses for these entities and our institutions.
Yes. No, this is very important. So tell me something. You're an intellectual property lawyer. You have a number of clients. Just give me 3 examples of things that you are working on. And I know you work in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. because examples are important for people to understand what is involved. Give me 3 examples of what you are working on for intellectual property protection. It can be either in Trinidad and Tobago or it can be in the region.
So currently, I engage in a lot of intellectual property education. So I would go to the various workshops and advise persons on the intellectual property, get them comfortable with the different terms, and show them ways in which they can exploit their works. I have taken on specific clients where we're looking at ways that they can expand without having to expend a lot of resources. So these are clients where they're in various fields, because the beauty of intellectual property is that it subsists in every field.
Yes.
And so, for example, I have a manufacturing company, and the company has been having a lot of issues in terms of accessing foreign exchange, and in terms of, the various lockdowns, of course. And what we have been trying to do is build a franchising model where they are able to lean on their already very well-known trademark that has a lot of value attached to it and expand through franchising. Another option we're also working at is to expand the range of services and goods that they are currently offering. And even though it's in a completely new field, we are leaning on the trademark to immediately bring some success and reputation behind these new goods and services. So it's not like if they're starting from scratch, they actually, have a following, persons recognize the brand, they attach a particular quality and reputation to it. And so we're leaning on that to then expand into various services and goods where they don't necessarily require a lot of foreign exchange. And it also in turn helps them to increase their revenue, grow their brand value, and grow the company as a whole.
Okay, well, let me take that one first, because there are lots of complexities there that we need to explain so people will understand it. Here you have a company with a powerful brand, but it has a foreign exchange problem because of a particular situation in Trinidad and Tobago. The way you are solving that foreign exchange problem is by changing the business model. And you are changing the business model to use the brand power in order to create franchising opportunities, right?
Correct.
So that's one thing. The second thing that you are doing is that you are leveraging the brand power in order to create a diversified range, a more diversified range of products and services that the company can use in the marketplace because it has brand power, brand recognition, and brand value and brand credibility. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. So
yes,
I wanted
correct.
to explain that and for people to understand that intellectual property and innovation does not only have to do with technological innovation. Okay?
Definitely.
So let me have your second example.
So the second example of what I'm currently working at is I have identified one issue locally, is that we are not able to put a value to intellectual property, and we are not able for financial institutions to use intellectual property as collateral. And this could be detrimental to many small to medium-sized entities where the majority of the value in the company is possibly the intangible assets or the intellectual property.
Yeah.
So what I have been working on recently is an attempt to create a marketplace where intellectual property can be traded. And when I say traded, I mean you can sell your rights, you can license it, you can create franchising models. So there are various ways in which you can exploit the IP. And I'm doing this on a regional basis. So I've been contacting various IP attorneys throughout the region and trying to create a regional platform so that our local SMEs have access to wider markets, because our markets are just too small to have any real and proper expansion, particularly if you're an SME. And so I've been working on creating this marketplace in the hopes that once we have a market where intellectual property can be traded, it can be sold, that financial institutions can now use intellectual property as collateral, because if they have to realize on the assets, they would now have a means of disposing of the said assets.
Yeah. But explain to our viewers what an intangible asset is. What is an intangible asset?
Yes, so an intangible asset.
Can I say this? A tangible asset is anything you can see and feel, etc. You know, it's a building, it is what you do, it is the product you create, etc. But what is an intangible asset? Let's deal with that.
So an intangible asset deals with things you cannot see, of course. So it's your intellectual creations. So that's where intellectual property comes in play. So it can be a trademark where the value you have in your company is the reputation and the goodwill that you have behind that trademark. Another example, for example, is a trade secret. If you look at Angostura, a lot of their worth behind the Angostura bitters is the fact that they have kept this as a trade secret, and it's not something you can see. It's not something you can, put on your balance sheet necessarily. But you know that the value comes from the fact that they have exclusivity for so many years because they kept it as a trade secret. In terms of know-how, that's something that you cannot put to paper. But because you and you alone know how to create something or know how something works and have all of this different knowledge that other entities don't have, you automatically have an advantage over them, and that in itself adds value to your company.
Yes.
And if an intellectual property valuation is done, a lot of entities may actually realize that the majority of their value lies in their intangible assets as opposed to their physical assets.
Yes, and you see, I think people don't understand that, and that is the shift that is taking place in the global economy that we don't understand. It's a knowledge economy. It's a fourth industrial revolution transformation that is taking place. And the physical things are just the basic requirements. It is everything else that is more important. That is why logistics now is more important than anything, and logistics today is determining the price of everything. But it's also determining, as with the online delivery, etc., it has everything to do with convenience and benefits to the customer. These are very important things. The second thing is the reputation that you talk about and the goodwill that you build. If you have a company and you have a crisis of any kind, it doesn't matter what kind of crisis, and your reputation is bad, your reputation in the marketplace is poor, you can hardly manage that crisis successfully. Because when you go there, you have a problem of credibility. You have a problem of belief. You have an immediate challenge of skepticism. and therefore you are unable to deal with it. But if you have a good reputation, no matter how complex the crisis is and how horrible the crisis is, the credibility that you have, the goodwill that you have, the reputation that you have that you have built over many years will allow you, first of all, to be listened to, and secondly, so people will be more receptive to what they listen to, and they are more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt so that you have time and opportunity to manage the crisis. So I want to explain to people what intangibles are and how valuable they are, and how in the world of knowledge now, and in the world in which intangible assets are so extremely valuable, and a lot of the intangibility rests in the heads of people and in the invisible connection between customer, product, and provider or manufacturer or deliverer of product, that the elements of the value chain are being reconfigured. And therefore it is not what you do, it is what you do after you do what you do to create the product, almost.
Definitely.
Okay,
Definitely.
and I wanted to focus on that shift because the issues that you are dealing with are very complex and they're very hard to understand in a kind of economy like ours, in which we argue about the same old things we've been arguing in the last century. And this is true of government, it is true of business, it is true of labor, it is true of the conversation in the society through the various media, etc., so that the knowledge capacity of the information system which the vast majority of the population receives is very low compared to where the rest of the world's conversation is on things like value chains, value creation, intellectual property, physical assets, intangible assets, etc. Okay, you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I've been talking plenty, sorry.
Yes, no, I definitely agree. I think we don't necessarily have a proper appreciation of how much our intellectual capital is worth. And while we may think it's intangible, you can't see it and it may not be that important, in more developed countries and where you have a marketplace that is created, you are able to actually reflect the value of that on your balance sheet. You're able to add that to the value of your company. So when you go to a financial institution, they see the value and they understand the value, they know how it works. And I think, the starting point for us is definitely understanding how valuable these assets are. It may be intangible, you may not be able to see it, but it's extremely important. And, you may see businesses and they may have the same amount of resources as another company, and yet they are superbly more profitable. And what accounts for that difference, in terms of revenue streams, is what you cannot see. It is their intellectual capital, their know-how, their trade secrets, their trademarks, whether they have any, protected patents, so, they are benefiting from exclusivity in the marketplace.
Yeah.
So it's definitely
also
something to look at and consider.
Also their structure, their organization, and their systems. Those things make a little bit, Schumpeter, who is credited with being conceptually the father of entrepreneurship and innovation, because he talked about what really creates the conditions for innovation in a business, and I'm talking about 1 century ago. He talked about these elements. He talked about some of these elements in innovation, how you structure your business, how you organize it, all the intangible elements in it. It's not just finance. It's not just the factory. It's not just the physical space. It's not just the workers that you have and their competence and so on. All of these things are important. But he talks about the 5 variables in which he begins to talk about some of these intangible assets. Of course, markets is one. The great economists that we have produced in the Caribbean, Arthur Lewis, said everything begins with the market. That one sentence of Arthur Lewis's voluminous work means so much in economics and economic theory and economic strategy that it is often missed. But it's a simple sentence. Everything begins with the market. Whatever you do, it has to have value in the marketplace, whether it is a thing or whether it is something you cannot see. I will give you an opportunity to close now because we've got to go to the news. And I don't know if you want to say anything about it at this point that is important, or you want to add another client that you are working with and the kind of problems you're trying to solve for them.
In terms of wrapping up, I don't mind, speaking about where I see intellectual property going in the country, because it may sound that like we are, not very developed in the field, but the reality is that we do have the relevant laws, we have relevant enforcement provisions. And if we look towards, for example, our trade policy from 2019 to 2023, there's a focus on intellectual property rights and development thereof. And there are certain policy measures that are intended to be put in place to further develop intellectual property rights in Trinidad and Tobago. For example, they're looking towards creating a secure transaction scheme where intellectual property rights can be used for collateral, and they're looking towards specific financial institutions that can value intellectual property rights. They're looking towards nationwide intellectual property audits where they will look at all these various entities, public institutions, academic institutions, and look at what intellectual property rights they have, ensure it's well protected, and see how they can exploit it. So I think while we have a long way to go in terms of the development of intellectual property rights, and while we may seem like we are a bit behind on the international scale, I think we have a lot of promise, a lot of opportunity, and I think it could definitely be used to further develop our knowledge-based economy and our economy as a whole locally here in Trinidad and Tobago and also as a region.
One quick question and quick answer before you go. What is the missing ingredient? What do we need to do? What is the missing ingredient? We have the laws, we have the capacity for enforcement, we have elements of it in policy. What do we need to do? What would trigger it?
I think what would trigger that is the creation of an intellectual property marketplace. Because, as you said, everything begins in the market. So until we can monetize it, so it's an asset just like you can sell and buy real property, when we have established an intellectual property market where these rights can be traded, immediately persons will understand the value of it. It will give a market value to these intangible assets, and it would also allow for collateralization of these assets. So I think, the creation of an intellectual property marketplace is what is the missing link and the missing piece here locally in Trinidad and Tobago.
Well, thank you very much, Territa Kalloo. I thought that your interview this morning, our conversation, brought a lot of clarity to an often blurry area, because it's not something that is easily understood, nor is it something that is effectively spoken about. And I want to thank you for your contribution this morning. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Tiwari. It was definitely a pleasure.
All right then. Okay, good luck in your work. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching Brighter Morning. You just saw attorney at law Territa Kalloo. She is an intellectual property lawyer, and she was explaining what is involved in that. And I want to thank you for watching Brighter Morning with Bo. I am Bo Tiwari, signing off just for a minute so that Shanil Alsiran can come and give you the news of the day. Thank you very much for watching and listening. MCTV, Multicultural TV, U97.5 FM, Hot Like Pepper, Multicultural Radio.